Welcome to the CFO Show. I'm your host, Melissa Howitson, CFO of Venna. Stepping into a private equity-backed CFO role is one of the most challenging and rewarding career moves in finance. The expectations are high, the timelines are tight, and the pressure to drive transformation is intense. Whether you're already working with private equity sponsors or looking to break into the space, understanding what makes a successful private equity CFO is key. From mindset shifts and financial modeling to investor communications and operational strategy, the role demands a unique blend of skills. In this episode, we'll unpack what it really takes to thrive as a CFO in a private equity environment and how finance leaders can position themselves for long-term success in this fast-paced, high-stakes world. Joining me today is Scott Engler, CEO of PE-Accelerate. With deep experience developing CFO talent for private equity firms, Scott helps finance professionals build the capabilities, confidence, and connections that they need to excel in PE-backed companies. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today.
Excited to be here. Good to see you again.
It is so good to see you again. And Scott, I got to meet you a few years ago at a conference that one of my private equity sponsors was hosting, and you did a session for us on what it takes to be an A-level CFO. And I got to say, it was really impactful for me. I remember sitting in the room and for a few moments, a little bit panicked, truthfully, because as you were starting to go through what it looks like, and I'm going, okay, I'm at a conference, it's going to be easy. I'm here to meet people, talk about things. And then you started getting into the content and I'm thinking, okay, am I here to be fired? Am I doing my job? And it was a good check yourself of, hey, are you an A-level CFO? Or are you one of those B or C guys? So it was good. And I really took a lot away from it. So really looking forward to diving into that conversation here with you.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed talking to the group, and I think the unique thing that we're trying to do is really define what that A player looks like. And so sometimes it's going to feel a little uncomfortable, right? Because you may not have considered the full spectrum. But most of the time, what I find is that CFOs who may not be at that A player, it's just because there are things that they didn't know, right? Or they hadn't thought about it that way. And that's actually one of the hypotheses behind PE-Accelerate is that we have all these hidden A players, right? And they're not hidden because we can't find them. They're hidden because they don't really understand the expectations and what it looks like, but they would be able to do that if they were able to see it and smell it, right? And so, sorry for making anyone uncomfortable, but the feedback that we usually get is, thank you for helping me see what I didn't know.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's the payoff.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's how I felt after was, it was good. Some great content. And so let's talk a bit, before I get into my questions, maybe you could share with the audience a little bit about yourself and what it is you're doing with PE-Accelerate.
So I started working with mid-market CFOs in 2007. I ran a group of about 900 to 1,000 CFOs in mid-market. And that wasn't just PE, that was across the board. I like to say we had the highest high tech and we had a manure company, right, in there. And so I got to work really cross industry, multiple levels. Usually, the bottom level was about 20, 30 million, but most of ours were in that 100 million range and up. And so I got to see the CFO seat from so many different perspectives. And I would go to a meeting with 30 CFOs and spend 8 hours with them in Chicago, and 30 CFOs and spend 8 hours with them in Boston, right? And it really helped hone, I think, really good radar for where A players were. And then when I moved to the executive recruiting side and started focusing on PE, what I found is that there was this sort of lack of definition of what an A player was, right? And so I started talking to operating partners and started talking to, if you look at the who's who of the top 20 list, right? Operating partners, and then talking to private equity executives that we knew were A players, and really developing this concept of what an A player is. And so that flows into PE-Accelerate, where we chalk the field. We help CFOs see the unknowns or the unknown unknowns, right? They always say, you hear from CFOs, I wish I'd known that earlier, right? Mm-hmm. They're the unknown unknowns that I think can get very hard to navigate. And so what we try to help executives do and private equity sponsors is see what that A player looks like, create a mindset and perspective around that, but then develop tool sets and strategies to be able to win. It doesn't help if I shock the field, show you what it is, help you understand the mindset, but I don't give you a way to win, right? And so a lot of what we focus on, we call it putting concepts into action, right? Can we put concepts into action? What's the quickest way to take concepts and put it into action? And so for PE Accelerate, we work with sponsors. So we'll run their CFO groups internally for them. But then we also have what I would call a B2C component where CFOs just pay through their own companies, individually join. And then we're doing some group accelerators as well, where we work with the entire senior leadership team.
Interesting. And so what I love about the business that you've put together is you've identified a need and you're helping to level up the talent pool, both for the individuals, but also then for the sponsors that need strong CFOs to be in seat. And so there's this gap in the middle that it sounds like your group is trying to help shrink the gap and increase the quality of the pool, which is great. So it sounds like a lot of what you do is around private equity and helping private equity to find great CFOs. Let's talk about what is different in terms of what's required to be a great private equity CFO compared to, say, VC-backed or founder-led company or public company.
Yeah, fantastic question. A CFO is not a CFO is not a CFO in all these different circumstances. And, we use these broad terms. And one of the hard parts around this is that private equity is any private money, right? So private equity actually spans all of them, but private equity, when it's used traditionally, is a more mature investment, right? And it could be an LBO situation, leveraged buyout situation. And so that's traditionally how private equity has been referred to. But growth equity, which is, to use, who's the Shark Tank? Kevin O'Leary, right? Gas on the fire, right? You're trying to bring resources that allow that organization to scale quickly, to capture market, to attain that unicorn status. And then on the venture capital side, you've got a lot of sort of founder interactions, fundraising, putting in place the mechanisms that would allow us to scale into the future. And so while they're all CFO jobs, they're all a little different. And the nomenclature doesn't help because we always hear private equity, and private refers to VC, private refers to growth, private refers to the LBO market. So we usually try to, just to make it simple, say there's VC, growth, PE, and those are all different. Now let's throw public into the equation. Now, public, it's a bit of a different animal. Roxy Wen, who's one of our faculty members who I've worked with for over a decade, she said, in a public company, you help to set the target that you then try to help the company to beat. In a private equity situation, you have to reach X amount of value in Y amount of years, or I could get fired. Right? So that gives you a little bit of the delineation. It's not like they're completely different roles, but in a public company, oftentimes what they struggle with is there's no burning platform. And when you're trying to hit quarterly numbers while you're trying to do this long-term growth play, right, and please your investor community, it's a whole lot of rubbing your belly, patting your head. And the private equity one's a little bit different because you're going to be given a lot more latitude. You can make some short-term changes that you don't have to worry about the quarterly numbers, right? But you step onto a burning platform. You don't have to wait for the burning platform. You're literally joining on a burning platform where the timer has been set and the timer starts ticking, right? Once you enter the role, and now you've got to figure out how to take this investment portco from an A state to the B state to maximize exit value. And the CFO, this is the scary part, right? CFO gets blamed for everything and is on the hook for everything. And one of the things I think is great about the job is the amount of impact you can have. You're not constrained by normal CFO, stay in your lane stuff. You've got to be cross-functional and all the other leadership capabilities that we talk about. And, I think the public to private side becomes hard for public company CFOs who are used to working in this kind of slower pace. The quarterly numbers, the way you talk to investors, it's just a little bit of a different animal. It's not like there are great public company CFOs who go into private equity and do fantastic, right? And they have that investor chop, but they are different as far as how those things roll out, what the expectation is. And also in the public world, you have a board, but you don't have a private equity sponsor who's asking you for data, who is constantly coming back to you, and where you're managing this ecosystem where you've got a board, you've got the private equity deal partner, who is arguably the most powerful person in that equation because they're the ones who are going to take that deal and get the most value from it. Then you may have an operating team. And then you have your CEO, who is your direct boss, but the private equity investor who's your owner. And that's a different realm to navigate than the public company board. And they're just a little bit different. Doesn't mean that one's better, harder than the other. They're just a little bit different animals.
What do you think is the biggest mindset shift that needs to occur for a CFO stepping into private equity?
Ownership of all outcomes. I think ownership writ large is the big one. Then there's a lot of subcomponents in there when we talk about our different, leadership capabilities. But this idea that you own all the outcomes of your portco, and you may be having conflict with your head of sales, you may be in conflict with your CEO, but that's not an out, right? It's your job to work through that. You may have a product team that's underperforming. Well, then what resources do we need to put on that product team to get that to be a high performing product team? You've got to quickly come in, you've got to diagnose, and you got to be, you have to have the ownership mentality. You might remember in that conference, we talked about ownership mindset. That I think is the most critical thing, because the rest of them don't work unless you truly view yourself in that ownership mentality. And by the way, most private equity, you are an owner, right? You've got a piece of the company. You're going to get paid on the equity component of that as it improves, right? You're going to get paid on that. So I think that is the biggest piece. And realizing while the job says CFO, you're really a CFO CXO. And if that requires you to work out of your lane, you got to work out of your lane. You might need to be a go-to-market expert for the next 3 months. And you might need to delve into territories. You may need to dig into the product side, right? And really understand if we're going to go hire, engineers, et cetera, where is the problem, right? It's almost like an Elon Musk kind of hat. If you ever, read about how Elon operates and he gets underneath. Those are the effective CFOs. And then you have to do that while you're working with all these different constituencies, while you're driving resource alignment. And, I think a lot of CFOs, when they hear me talk about it, they go, wow, that's actually a little scary. The CFOs I know in private equity who are in there love it. Like the ones who are, really embrace that, because it's unlike any other job. There was one CFO we interviewed in this project, and he said, I never want the CEO job. Why would I want that job? All of the effectiveness in private equity comes out of the CFO seat if it's done well with partnership with the CEO. And if you look at some of the data, by the way, it gets pretty interesting, because some of the data will show that CFOs are more valued. I think it might have been Accordion or one of the other groups that works in private equity that showed that CFOs were number 2 on the hit list and CEOs were number 7.
Wow. Well, and it is interesting because you highlight, need to recognize there's similarities in a job, but there's differences and what it is you need to do to be able to excel. And as you said, it could be seen as scary, but exciting because you get that
Right.
chance to play such a bigger role. And I think the other part is, at least from my experience, CFO and private equity, is you've got others who want you to win. And so they have your back and are there as part of your team. You've got the team of folks who represent the private equity. You talked about the different roles. They're there to have conversations with you, to bounce ideas, to put you in touch with other CFOs or leaders across their portfolio companies. They don't want you to feel you have to go this alone. And actually, it can give you a lot of tools to accelerate your path through challenges, through issues, because chances are it's being felt, experienced elsewhere, or they've seen it. And they, by partnering across your business and across your investors, you can actually go quicker than you might have thought you could. And it helps to remove what otherwise could seem daunting if you've never done it before, because it's expected, but they're going to help you get there. And if there's a problem identified and it really is the problem, you're going to have that support to go tackle it and actually address it. So you have to have the people skills to navigate through these things. But, I've certainly never felt alone in doing it. You need to lead, but you're not by yourself, which I love about it.
Well, and you have the benefit of working with 2 very good active private equity sponsors. I know them both well,
Mhm.
right? And so that's not always the case. And I don't mean that to disparage the other ones, but there are a lot of private equity investments where the deal partner is really running the show. There's not a big operating component, and the CFO needs to go figure it out. But to your point, when you are interviewing, you have to understand what does support look like, and you need to maximize whatever that support is, right? The firms that you work with happen to be very exceptional on that side of the equation. And one of the jobs of a CFO is to figure out what does that look like? Like, where does my support come from? And then you need to maximize that support. You also, there's a subtle dance that goes on when you're dealing with an operating partner. I know your operating partners very well, so I can speak to them and their personality. There are other operating partners. I'll give you an example. When I was running this research project, this one operating partner said, it's my job to find holes in that CFO, the holes in the CFO's story. Now, because one of the things that also is going on is there's this constant poking to figure out where there are fault lines within the investment thesis or the execution against the investment thesis. And analysts get paid for that. There's a very large private equity firm where one of the CFOs who worked for that private equity firm was in a portco running it as the CFO. And he said, Scott, my biggest problem is the analysts. They never stop pinging me for information. And I work for the company. We have the same the same person signs our paychecks. And I can't stop them, right? And so it's really important to understand the dynamics of the private equity sponsor. But then to your point, maximize those resources where they are, but also understand and how to get on the same page. Like, one of the things we talk about is how to get on the same page with your operating team, right? Start off with how they see the universe, listen, understand what makes sense to them. How have they worked with great CFOs in the past? What does a fantastic relationship look like? What kind of reporting makes them happy? What kind of off-channel conversations? There are CFOs who talk to their operating partner every single day. There's one very tenured CFO who doesn't go a day without calling his operating partner. There are others that they only check in when they have to, and they kind of hide their homework from their operating partners. And that's obviously not the best situation. But understand the personality, understand the resources, understand what a working relationship looks like. All really important stuff to get clear on up front with any kind of a new sponsor that you're working with.
And I think that's an important part, right? As you're getting into the role, really asking those questions and knowing what this is going to look like, getting some clarity and alignment on those expectations so that you're just eyes wide open and you can really assess, okay, is this going to be for me? Is this something I feel like I'm up to? And that is going to be something that I'm going to get enjoyment out of doing as well, right? Because it's a lot of work. So we got to be up for the challenge. Now let's talk about what it is that you think differentiates A-player CFOs from, say, those B's, C's, or even D's.
We were working with a talent partner at a very large top 5 private equity shop. And that talent partner said, I would change out 85% of my CFOs if I could tomorrow.
Wow.
That gives you an idea of what the spectrum looks like, right? There's probably 10 to 15% that are A players, right? And I'll call those performance leaders. Then you've got sort of the B, C players. I'll call them guidance CFOs, right? And then you've got the governance CFOs who are the D players. The governance CFO is the CFO who's got the reporting nailed down. They're making sure that the budgeting process runs well. They're keeping the trains running, and they're playing a much more of a risk mitigation role in that CFO seat. The guidance CFOs kind of in the middle. Those guidance CFOs, they're leaning in, they're providing data, they're helping drive decision making. And the B players obviously do this in a more forward way. C players tend to be a little bit behind the curve, right? B players are pushing into helping you see around corners a little bit. The A player does all of that, but they're also leaning in. When something shows up and it's not right, they don't report on it. They immediately dig underneath that. And it doesn't matter if it's in the CFO's normal realm. They're figuring that out as quickly as possible. They're getting to quick diagnosis. We talked about OODA loops at our session, right? Observe, orient, decide, act. Quickest you can observe, orient to it, decide what to do, act, right? And that was one of my favorite things with Harry, right? Is like, we love slow competitors, right? But that's the performance CFO. If Guidance CFO is the one who preps the team, makes sure the roster is good, right? The performance CFO is in the first quarter, the entire game plan goes to, and now that CFO is leaning in and figuring it out. And as you know, an investment hypothesis is a hypothesis, right? It's based on imperfect information, on a whole bunch of assumptions, and there are going to be constant changes. That performance CFO is constantly sensing, right, into the future, how that investment thesis, value creation plan is playing, right? And trying to figure out, well, wait a minute, I see this coming around here and that coming around here. One CFO that we used in our interview process said, you're anticipating the next decision. So that's the performance leader CFO, right? And they have the gravitas to get the payoff on that. They can communicate to the operating partner. They can communicate to the deal partner, and they communicate to the CEO in a way that impels action, right? And that's the credibility, right? That's when that CFO can get any job he or she wants. They've already had that impact. They've driven to an outcome, and they may use different tools in different ways, but I think that's the essence of it. They are challenging the assumptions, constructively challenging. They're known as the candid person with the right information. The private equity firm doesn't have to bring them information. They're bringing it to the private equity firm. All of those things kind of play into that A player. And, not surprisingly, they tend to have better outcomes.
Before we continue our conversation, I think this would be a great time to answer one of our audience questions. Make sure you stick around to catch the second half of our discussion. Here's our audience question. What's one mindset shift or leadership habit you think all CFOs, whether in PE or not, should adopt to stay competitive in today's fast-moving finance landscape? The one thing that I think all CFOs need to do to be successful is really lean into their curiosity to understand their business. You have to understand all the different moving parts within the business, not just what's happening in the world of finance. And I think along with that comes the need to be curious, because that's how we start learning about the rest of the business, and also building bridges and aligning amongst different parts of the business. You really can't do that if you don't have that curiosity and you aren't leaning into that broader understanding of your business. When I think about, the shifting landscape around us, and one could argue that, uncertainty is the new norm because we're coming off of a number of years now of different things driving uncertainty. Certainly right now in the backstop, we've got what's happening in the economic climate. We've got artificial intelligence that's here and moving pretty quickly. Do you think that it's still the same things for what's going to define A players in these times, or is there anything that's different?
Really good question, right? And so everything that I talked about requires a CFO to have forward antennae, right? And to develop those forward antennae. And that's not just your data, right? I think CFOs get caught a little bit on data. Data by nature is usually backward, right? Mm-hmm. But it's having those relationships outside the firm, right? In across private equity, understanding what's happening from an AI perspective and understanding where it fits. So if there were a new leadership capability into the, addition to the 5, I would almost call it the capability builder, right? Where you're thinking about future capabilities that need to be built in the organization to enable. When we did our research a few years ago, the only way to win in the short term and the long term is to win in the short term while you build long-term capabilities. And so if you're making bets in the short term, but you're not building long-term capabilities, you're actually going to create diffusion of focus of the organization, right? Because you're going to start having capability set that gets wider and less focused and isn't necessarily aligned against what that future, trend situation looks like. So if I were to add one in there, it might be the capability leader, something like that, where we're constantly thinking of the next layer of capabilities that we need to develop. And that also means we need to deprecate some of the traditional capabilities. So, one of the hardest things in any organization is to make resource allocation decisions because everything seems like a great idea. And you want to be great at everything. The reality is you can't be great at everything, right? There is an interlocking set of capabilities, 3 to 5, whatever it is for your org, that gives you that competitive advantage. That necessarily means you're not going to be awesome at everything, right? And so, I call them threshold capabilities. There's some stuff we just got to be okay at. And then there's some stuff that we have to be best in class at, no question, right? And the CFO has to be able to drive that thinking around what is that capability set that we need to be best in class at to outperform. And we need to fund that. And we need to be able to defund the other stuff so that we can fund the new stuff. And so maybe it is an AI transformation center, that some people are considering right now. Or, when you think about what's happening in the environment, there are some that have sort of these hypo policy committees, right, where they get the hypos together and they're interpreting the trends and the risks. By the way, risk is, I think, the CFO's best friend, because also on the other side of risk is opportunity. So if you're keeping eye on risks, the flip side is everything that is a risk has a corresponding opportunity. And the company that handles that risk better than their peers is going to be the company that comes out ahead. But it's an awesome question. I'm sure there's a lot of other things to consider, but that's the one that kind of comes top of mind.
You talk about that challenge of it's the easiest thing in the world to say yes. It's deciding what it means you're going to also say no to. And especially if something has become a pet project or a capability internally that once upon a time maybe did make sense, but doesn't for the current set of circumstances. It can be very challenging to take the brave risk to say, no, we're not going to do that because we need more here. And it's easier is to sort of partly fund the new thing, but leave some of the dollars where they were before. And then, like you said, you get this diffusion that can happen that can be really painful. But, I always think it takes the ability to be brave, to be clear on the why, to help bring the business along and to not underestimate the change management aspects of doing that so that you get people really on board and not, quietly hanging on to the old thing while you're really trying to direct towards something that's new. So takes lots of working across the business to make it happen for sure.
It's hard decision making. And, the thing is, the secret that no one wants to talk about is you don't usually get fired for peanut buttering. Spreading the peanut butter all around. You can get fired for putting all your eggs in a basket. And so there's a certain amount of risk that comes with being mindful of your choices, right? And where you're going to defund and things you are going to fund. And the second, to your point, is most of the time we have what's called unfunded mandates. We'll put a little something over here and we kind of hope it goes, but it never really, we never didn't flush it out. People had all these they call it subconscious subversion. Did we talk about this at all? I don't remember. It's one of my favorite concepts, though. It's when you say yes, but subconsciously you don't think it's actually going to work. So you subconsciously torpedo it.
Never done that.
I would say if you ever were in a dating situation and you just kind of blew up the dating situation for some reason that didn't make any sense, that's subconscious subversion, right? And so you do have to handle that. It really gets to another point. Sorry for getting all excited here, but you got to a really important point. One of the key things that came out of the research is the CFO has to be an A player when it comes to transformation. They have to understand what change management looks like. You have to drive hard decision making, and you have to drive talent decisions. And ultimately, you've got to drive culture, which people don't normally think of when they think of a CFO, right? They don't think of that basket of stuff. But you're in private equity, you understand, right? You got to move fast, and that requires shifting a lot of resources. And as one of our CFOs said, my main job is to mobilize resources against that which matters.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that culture piece, because for me, that was, one of the things along the way in my career, I'd say for sure early on when I started, I underestimated the importance of playing there and leaning in, working closer with my HR partner and helping to drive that. And was at a conference a couple of years ago, one of our sponsors, and they brought together the CHROs and the CFOs together at this conference. And I sat at one of the tables and later heard that somebody said, we were talking and then the conversation we were having, I assumed that she was a CHRO and later surprised to find out that she was the CFO. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I actually took it as a compliment in terms of that one interaction and just been at one table talking about something where I thought, oh, look at that. Hopefully it's not just because I was a female that that was assumed, but the conversation. And I thought, we have to, not necessarily wear that CHRO hat because, that's our partner that we respect and work closely with, but really understand where they're coming from and leaning into driving that alongside. Because I find if you can't bring the people along on the decision you've made, It's just an uphill battle. And so you've got to find ways that you're going to help people get on board with where you need to go.
A lot of that, which we cover in this transformation model, right? It's speeding to disagreement. People don't think about that when it comes to change. But if you think of the 5 stages of grief, that's any time you're introduced to a new concept, you kind of have this process of fighting back against it. What you need to be able to do to get real change is speed people to the disagreement so that you can get clarity in the disagreement, so you can disagree and do it anyway, so you can come out the backside and you can start getting it done. But to your point on talent, in your portfolio that you're a part of, how much budget do you think goes to people on average? What percentage? Ballpark's fine.
Oh, across all of the companies?
Yeah.
70%?
And then how much of your output is driven by your people?
Oh, all of it.
Right. And so why wouldn't a CFO embrace the talent side? Right. And especially because with lack of alignment, here's what's going to happen. It's not just the change management, which you correctly point out. If you can't get people bought in, it only takes one person in one location to kill an entire project, right?
Yeah.
And that's a Horowitz hard thing about hard things that's not on the bookshelf, but it's a great read, especially for CFOs. But the other thing is, if your best talent isn't on the most important stuff, that's a fail. And traditionally, we keep our best talent in the lane that they've been in because that's what they were made successful. But if you're going to win in this fast-moving environment where you're changing from an A state to a B state, you need to have your best people on the right stuff. And that means some hard goodbyes. It means constantly scraping off the capability sets at the bottom, but reinvigorating that, because the problem is if people aren't in the best spots, that's what kills engagement. People talk about, and we do an engagement survey. I'm like, okay, tell me about strategic clarity and tell me about your resource allocation from a people perspective. You tell me those 2 things. And if those are positive and those are highly thought of, we're really clear on strategy, we think we got the right people in the right seats, chances are you're going to be winning and your engagement score is going to be really high. What the CFO needs to do is drive that clarity together with the CHRO and the CEO. I know we're a little off tack. We're in that 3rd module, not the 1st module, but it's such an important point, and the CFO has got to be leaning in because no one else has the CFO's perspective. Right? CFO is master of the numbers, only one who has enterprise-wide view of the numbers, has operational intimacy, and is dealing with investors and understands the entirety of the investment thesis and how it's going to get sold. CEO doesn't even have all that piece, right? And so if the CFO is not leaning in and doing it, how are the decisions going to be made in the right way, right? And the answer is they're not going to be, and that's a big performance fail.
Well, you can tell that you and I are both a little bit passionate about this topic. Let's step back to, because you talk about 5 differentiated capabilities that A player CFOs need to have. So can you run us through what those 5 are?
Yeah, they're the performance leadership, enterprise leadership, transformational leadership, which we've been talking about, insight leadership, and strategic investment leadership. I'll take you through one by one with kind of a cliff notes, right? And I'll start off with the negative, right? Performance leader, here's what you'll hear about the CFO. They didn't understand the pacing. They didn't show a true ownership mentality. They didn't drive alignment on the few things that matter, right? So the performance leader is about driving that clarity, that alignment, about setting the operational cadence, driving the pacing. And that's through reporting. It's also through meetings, but it's also instilling this ownership mentality and prepping us for the holes that you are 100% going to be hitting, right? But if you hit them and you have no plan, that's different than you saw a possible hole and you have an optionality around that hole, right? So performance leadership is driving that pace, right? It's that thing that Harry talked about, right? We love slow competitors. Pacing is everything. You're on a 3 to 5 year hold generally, right? And that timeline is going to be dictating how you're viewed by the deal partner, et cetera. But the faster you get that done and the faster you're moving, more quicker you're going to realize value. One of the CFOs who's part of our faculty, she just hit her 3-year mark and they hit their valuation goal, which is just amazing, right? 3 years, fantastic, $2.4 billion valuation. She's going to have a great, great career, right? Already has it. Enterprise leadership, think of this as cross-functional, whole worth more than the sum of the parts. This is the CFO. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to go where the problem is. You don't stay in your lane. But more than that, you are what we call a lighthouse leader. There are only 3 non-biased people in the leadership group in a company. That's the CFO, the CHRO, and the CFO. The only one who has mastery of the numbers is the CFO. The only one who has true operational intimacy and enterprise-wide view is the CFO. If that CFO does not step into that lighthouse leadership role, which is I am the one who has to constantly make sure our leaders are on the same page. And when a leader's off script, I need to be able to have that conversation and keep them on script, right? So enterprise leadership is making sure that the whole is worth more than the sum of the parts. It's understanding where we have misalignment. And then another underlying piece is making sure the org understands how the numbers relate to what they do. If you're doing a widget job, but you don't understand how what you do for making a widget relates to what it is we're trying to accomplish, when something changes in your role, you're not going to be able to make any adjustments, right? And we need to drive financial literacy as it relates to strategic clarity. So that's enterprise leadership. Transformation leadership is the A to the B state. And it was probably the biggest surprise in the research project was talking to all these operating partners who are like, they just don't understand the lift when it comes to change. They're not owning the change, right? And there's so many components of this that you and I have already talked about, but you are responsible for changing the resource allocation dynamic of the org. That's your people, that's your budget, that's also processes, that's your IT. I almost slipped and just said AI, but AI, IT, right? It's all of that stuff. And you want to get rid of bad customers. I mean, the number one thing that happens to get into like an organization that's been floundering for a while is you've got a shitty customer problem. Sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to swear here, but right. But you need to rationalize that, which is then you have to drive ongoing decision making. One of the things about change is that what the CFO really has to do is help people understand the model by which they need to make decisions. Because something that's not talked about is 85% of decisions are not made with oversight. They're made by that executive or that middle manager in the role without asking anyone else, and there's discretion in it, and they make that decision. Now, those hundreds of decisions that are made every week, if they're not made in line with where we're going, that's going to derail our transformation. So how do we drive good decision-making when it comes to where we're going? How do we move talent? It's a reality that you're going to have to constantly get rid of roles, right? Especially with AI coming in, right? And thinking about where it can play. And then culture, which I think a lot of CFOs don't embrace. You are a culture leader, right? And culture ultimately comes down to the way you do things. Then insight leadership, the way you'll hear this one is they got caught looking. We had to bring them the information. We got surprised. Private equity hates surprises. Insight leadership is using that finance team, using your data, using your team, using the way you report out your business reviews, using the tools in the tool set to help everyone see ahead, right? It's this antennae, this forward-looking piece of it. You want to, I call it forward pattern recognition. That's kind of like the key thing to get right. Can you create forward pattern recognition? Because if you don't, that means your decision-making is going to be at the here we are now level or the where we've been level. And that is going to drive you backward. And by the way, if you're able to drive this sort of insight leadership, that's when you hear we have great confidence in that CFO, right? That CFO helps us. And we want to go to that CFO before we make a decision. And then the strategic investment leader is, look, ultimately you're being bought to be sold or taken public, right? There's some exit in the private equity world. They're not buying you to hold forever. There are some PE firms that do have a hold forever mentality. But for the most part, we're in a transaction. And in that, you have three realms. You've got the realm of your senior leadership team, which is how most CFOs think of themselves, right? And you got the senior leadership team, then you got the portco and your finance team, and you're managing that one ecosystem. But then there's the ecosystem, right, of your investors. You may have one investor. You may have multiple investors. They have deal partners. They likely have operating teams. They have boards. And you're going to be reporting to those boards. And so how are you managing that against what your CEO is thinking, what's going on at the portco level? And then against that, how is that story getting taken to market, right? When you're talking to your secondaries, when you're talking to your strategics, when you're talking to investment bankers, it is the case where CFOs lose their job because the investment banker goes back to the PE firm and says, that CFO cannot take us public. And that starts a confidential search in the background. And so it's all of those leaders. I think that strategic investment leader is really you boil up the true A player, because you can't play that role really well unless you've mastered the other four capabilities. But when you see that strategic investment leader role, they're the ones who are driving the story, driving the valuation, having those conversations, and ultimately the ones who get you to hopefully that nice exit that everyone's pointed towards.
So that was great. And I know there's so much we could unpack under each one of those, which is why you've got entire seminars that you run to talk about these different kinds of leadership and what it actually means. Maybe we could talk for just a minute on the performance leader, just diving in a little bit more clearly there. What are the top things that they do?
So, it's easier to also talk about the things that go wrong. And, it's kind of a root cause, then build back up theory of how I've done leadership work over the years. Because if you're not on the right root cause, it really doesn't matter what the prescription is, right? If you haven't diagnosed the situation. So here are the things that go wrong. There's usually, even in really good leadership teams, misalignment on the leadership team around what the underlying drivers are and how they relate to each other. And the CFO has to constantly drive that alignment and that clarity and then help people contextualize. Because remember, your senior leaders are not finance people, right? And so they have to be able to contextualize, and your marketing head has to be able to take that down and talk to his or her team, right? Your product person, et cetera. So the first failure point is lack of cohesion around the underlying drivers of performance and how they relate to each other. It's why the pre-work, by the way, for that first module is to deconstruct a business model through 20 points of differentiation, right? Because you need that context as a CFO to be able to drive those discussions. Next is the biggest performance challenge, like maybe 1 and 2 with that, is your investment thesis is wrong. You will learn as you start operating what's wrong and what's not wrong. You have to be able to help the organization anticipate around that and prepare for those eventualities. If, for example, you built an entire thesis around selling to enterprise customers, like McAfee, by the way, which was a carve out from TPG years ago, and it turns out that sales cycle's too long, that margin's not the right margin, it costs way too much to service, and it's much more of a B2C play. Let's get McAfee on every computer out there and we'll charge individual customers. We have to be able to run to those problems quickly, diagnose when we're off, right? So that's the second piece, is like this underlying, we haven't diagnosed the underlying squishy assumptions that this bet was on. The third one is simply a mindset issue. You could call this number 1, like ownership and accountability. That's in the CFO seat, it's on the finance team, but also in the org, right? Everyone, you see a problem, you fix the problem. Right? In JetBlue, a pilot would walk down, they'd see a gum wrapper on the floor. They were told to go pick up that gum wrapper off the floor, right? Everything is everyone's job. Operating cadence. Are we moving fast? Are we pulling up, sensing what's going on, interpreting it, and moving faster than our competitors? And with that, incentive alignment, one of our CHROs said, none of this stuff works if your incentives are all misaligned. And that means getting down to the mid-manager level too, especially if the cap table's not going down that far. And then the last piece of that is the analytics. Are you providing the analytics that truly are giving us insight into where they're going? And so we'll see fall down on all those pieces. And so the reverse is also true, right? Are we driving that small group of analytics that actually is telling us the right story? Or are we providing every analytic, data point under the sun and hoping that people will sift through the dog's breakfast and find the healthy choice, right? And by the way, with that, do we build the right capabilities in our team? Because if you're going to be awesome at some things as an organization and not at the other, same is true of your finance team. You're going to have to be awesome and better than your competitors around certain things. So I'm going to wind these back. They develop an operating cadence. So they focus their analytics on the most important thing. They build their team that way. They build their data infrastructure that way. They create an operating cadence. And that's for reporting. That's how we pull up for business reviews, and how we then cycle that information back into the organization. They model that mindset and they challenge that mindset. When they see a mindset that's not an ownership and accountability mindset, they step in and they ask questions. And, you could be pretty blunt, right? So here's the situation you're bringing to us. I'm trying to understand why you didn't diagnose that piece of it on your own. Can you tell us what that process is? And sometimes that's a hard conversation. But that's the CFO stepping in really driving that ownership mentality. Getting clear on what those assumptions are that are most meaningful to your investment thesis. What are those critical assumptions? How certain are you of those? And how much do they impact? So we have that, the 2x2 that I showed your group, right? That's like the squishy assumptions are my favorite. They're really important, but we don't have high confidence level. Well, test those first, right? How do we figure out if those are true? Because if we're going to pour resources on that as a CFO, that's going to be a big fail. So They drive clarity on the squishy assumptions and the certain assumptions they pour resources onto. And then that first one is, one of my favorite ones is driving clarity on underlying performance drivers. We say you prototype and do a discovery tour, break down your business model, put together a driver analysis, take it on go with your PE firms, right? If you have two PE firms, get alignment on that, because I guarantee you they don't have perfect alignment if you got two sponsors. Get clarity on what that is with your operating teams, with your CEO, then do your roadshow. We advise CFOs to go on a discovery tour. There's a listening tour, that's fine. But discovery tours, we're showing you something and allowing you to comment on it that is meaningful and directive to the organization versus listening without a context or goal, right? And so, if you look at Dave Ulrich's work where he looked at what's the number one driver of financial outcomes, what's the number one driver of strategic outcomes, what's the number one driver of business outcomes, and what's the number one driver of customer outcomes, strategic clarity of the 13 things is the number one driver in every single category, right? And so CFO has to think of him or herself as that driver of alignment, right? And that allows you to go fast. When we have that clarity, when we can see the bumps, when we're moving at a right cadence, we're getting information and people see something, they say something, they do something, and we're getting the right analytics, that's a performance leader, right? And that's what we focus on really in that first module.
So much goodness there. It's funny, you talked a bit about the analytics and how many of them and the data. And I remember you talked about a buffet. And I have this picture of this god-awful looking buffet that you had up on the screen where you don't want to have the data like the buffet, because you've got to be directing, okay, what really matters here? And what does this mean? Help people understand, okay, this is what you really want to have, and this is where we're going to go. So yeah, that clarity and absolutely that helping people understand the strategy, the why, where are we going, and making sure. And sometimes I feel like you have to just keep beating that drum because you think people know, but they can forget. You have new people in the business. And so, this constant reinforcement so that people understand this is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is how you're going to fit in, and why we need you to help drive the change forward. So
you cannot say that enough as a CFO to as many groups enough. There's no way you can communicate enough, over communicate on that stuff, right? It takes between 7 and 21 repetitions before something seats in your subconscious.
You've seen lots of different CFOs or people transitioning into private equity CFO. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see them made when they're transitioning?
The first one is you just hear pacing all the time, right? It's like they don't understand the pace of transformation, and let's not, call every private equity job the same. There's this huge spectrum, the 6,000 private equity firms. So there are nuances, styles, all of that stuff. But probably the number one thing you'll hear is they don't understand the pace, right? You're constantly scraping capabilities. You're constantly reinvigorating your go-to-market, right? You're constantly adjusting every little piece of this thing while you're trying to build toward the long term, while you're under this enormous pressure, while you may be leveraged. There's this pacing element, and they don't understand the pace, and the ownership piece, I think, is probably the biggest one. And then when it comes to the board and board communications, it's really helping drive the forward conversation. One of the operating partners who I respect a lot really pushes his CFOs hard. And the big thing is you cannot be in the back of the bus. You've got to be in the front seat driving the bus all the time. And by the way, there's a trick in this, Melissa, which, it's one of the many CFO tricks we've learned over the years. But one of the CFO tricks is if you're always pushing people's thinking, they don't have time to be critical of that which is going on right now. So there's a mental thing that happens when things are the same that we immediately, we just naturally want to start tearing it apart and finding the faults. But if you're constantly changing that thing, my mind doesn't go to all the faults. It's trying to interpret what the new thing is and trying to figure out the next thing. And so as CFOs think about how they're managing up, you're not talking about just the performance. You're talking about what is the next thing we need to be thinking about, and how can you frame, I called it's a big mental model lift. A lot of what a CFO does is rejigger the mental models in the heads of all those constituencies that we're talking about? Can you create the right mental frame? Because if everyone's looking through a different mental frame, you're going to have arguments. You're going to have disagreements. And I think not managing the stakeholders from multiple perspectives is one of the biggest things that I've seen. And there's a proactive piece about that. The first job I had on search was replacing a CFO who didn't know he was being replaced, right? It was a confidential search. And the problem they had is he missed a shift in the market. Private equity had to bring him the shift. Then he had to go back and do the analysis. And now they're way behind the eight ball. And once you fall into that low confidence bucket, very hard to get it back. You'll see tea leaves, like all of a sudden you're not brought into every conversation. Your phone calls might get less. You might get cordoned off in board meetings and only being asked to present X and not Y. So there are some subtle tea leaves to see where you've made the mistake. And the other thing I would say is listen to your leadership. Are they coming to you before things are decided? Or are they bringing you things as they're thinking about the thing? That tells you what your credibility looks like on both sides. If they're trying to involve you ahead of time, pretty much that's your CFO hack to know that I have credibility, I have confidence of the senior team, I have credibility of the senior team, and they view me as that really trusted driver of the investment thesis.
And on this point of credibility, how have you seen some of the best CFOs build that credibility quickly with their investors, their board members in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the things that, we talk about, we don't do it in depth, but one of the most important things is to have some off-channel conversations around expectations. CFOs naturally think they have answers to stuff. I don't know if that's you, but a lot of CFOs do, right? Because they can see it so clearly in their head. Right? It's so clear to them. However, that may not be the expectation of their operating partner. Their deal partner probably has no operating experience, right? Most of them actually don't have operating experience. Your board members could be all over the place. And so the first thing I think you need to do is understand where everyone is coming from. One of our modules, we actually take some time. They said, you have to understand where people are coming from. What's business success look like for them, right? You can't interpret that for them. You actually have to ask them, right? What does personal success look like for them? What's their relationship? How have they, a lot of CFOs struggle because the CFOs that deal partner worked with in the past weren't very good. So now that CFO has to overcome a previous bias. So really listening and having frank conversation, like, what are your expectations? How do you work the best? What do you need to see from me? And then nailing that stuff. Like, you don't play the lip service to it. Like, once you're clear, you got to nail that stuff. And then you want to make sure that you're keeping them looking good too. Because remember, everyone needs to look good, right? And it's like your deal partner needs to look good. They need a story to tell. Your operating partner needs to look good. They need a story to tell. What's the story you're helping them tell? And the same with your CEO.
I think that's great advice. And you've provided so many great pieces of insight here. If you had to give CFOs just two pieces of advice on what is going to help them be successful, what would it be?
First one would be truly understand all the nuances of the business model. We use a business model framework. We sent it to your group, by the way, and I don't think most people did it. But the framework is capability sets. What does value proposition look like? Customer segmentation, and then what does finance side look like, right? And you can think of that as two sides of it, right? The capabilities build the value proposition that goes to customers who pay you, they return money, and that goes back, and it's the circle of life. But you have to truly understand your business model from all the different facets, or you're probably going to lean to the finance side, and those conversations aren't going to be as helpful. And then what is the transformation that has to happen in the business model, right? So that's kind of one. And that means every question that comes in, you have to raise up to the investment thesis business model perspective. That's your job, right? To take every request that comes in, raise it up to that level. The second one is to kind of what we just talked about, is to truly understand what the expectations are from stakeholders. That's why the stakeholder management piece is so important. You got to get those things right. And then underneath that, you got to be driving, the cadence, et cetera. But when you don't truly understand the nuance of the business model, other people know that. When you talk in finance speak, that turns people off. When you help them see themselves in context with numbers, that turns them on, right? When you talk to a sponsor and you can tell You say, I know that you want to see X. Here's what we're seeing around that. That's going to help drive this learning loop. Because again, the big thing that I think separates CFOs who are A performers, when you look at the tea leaves, is the information flow. Is that information flow coming into you? Is it coming into you a way that you are able to make sense of it so that you can then re-energize the information flow? And yeah, I think those are two of the baskets of stuff that we talk about.
Thank you so much, Scott, for coming on and sharing so many great thoughts here. I'm sure the audience has found great value in this. Now, before I let you go, we do have 2 rapid fire questions that we like to ask our guests. So are you ready?
Oh boy. I think so.
First one, what is the hallmark of mature finance teams in terms of how they operate?
And the way that they operate, the business is coming to them. The hallmark of a really mature finance organization is when they want to include finance in any type of decision as it gets going. Anytime you find you're the third person to know, you've got a maturity problem. It could be a data problem. It could be a team problem. But and by the way, there's ways to engineer that too. But that I think is a true hallmark. They come to you before they want to do anything because they want to make sure that you are going to set them up for success. Now, the flip side is also the problem, right? But
couldn't agree more. And if you could recommend just one book that has had the biggest impact for you in your life or your career, what book would it be and why?
Oh, it's such a hard question. I'm gonna take this one. I'm gonna filter through the CFO lens, just because we're on the CFO show, right? So over my shoulder, you'll see that green book, Playing to Win by Roger Martin.
Yeah.
Where to play, how to win, how to enact, he calls it a strategy cascade. All CFOs should have that strategic context, right? About anything that's going on in the organization. And so to me, it's because I studied business model work we used to teach it, we used to teach strategy, and frankly, stuff's all over the board, right? This gives you a very clear, simple framework to interpret things that are going on in the organization. And, it's actually, we use some of their frameworks in the way we do our business model analysis, that kind of stuff. I'm going to throw in another one called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. It's just a book that everyone should read. It's operational, it's nitty gritty, lots of colorful language, but it really gets to the guts of operating in org and making hard choices and some of the things that trip people up. So that's a little cheating to the CFO side, but I think those 2 books, I get asked a lot from CFOs around what books they should read. I like those 2. I have some more recommendations, but we'll stop there.
Well, you gave us such good advice today. We'll let you have 2, just this once.
Awesome.
Scott, thanks again. Really enjoyed catching up with you again and appreciate you taking the time to come on the show.
So much fun, Melissa. Great to see you again.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more on this topic, sign up for our free newsletter with exclusive resources designed to help you grow your leadership skills and drive strategic transformation across your business. For the CFO Show, I'm Melissa Howitson. Until next time,